How could a husband who emptied his life's savings and bore every family burden not get a single seat at his wife's 22-table victory banquet? Through soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass, Julian Hale stood frozen, overhearing Clara Wells brush him off to reporters, calling him plain and awkward, unfit to mix with elite scientific circles. The white camellias he'd bought for her sat heavy in his arms, every ounce of 5 years' quiet devotion shattering into frigid shards right then and there. It was late autumn, and the sky-high ballroom of Harbour City International Hotel blazed under thousands of crystal chandeliers. A velvet-lined registration table stretched dozens of feet, covered with gilded guest books crammed full of signatures from the city's top research scholars, university presidents, and biotech CEOs. 22 solid oak round tables lined the vast event space, each decorated with custom floral arrangements, luxury gift sets, and wine printed with Clara's portrait. The air hummed with the rich mingling scent of champagne, high-end perfume, and fine French cuisine. Tonight marked Clara's award celebration. She had claimed the National Premier Life Science Medal, a one-of-a-kind national honor that came with a $700,000 cash prize and full authority to build a state-funded independent research lab. The entire northern scientific community had been stirred by her win. University chancellors and Nobel-nominated biologists had flown in to attend, and the hotel had reserved the entire top floor, arranging 22 full tables of distinguished guests. Local government news outlets had even run previews of the lavish event. The whole city knew Clara was living her moment of blinding glory. Everyone except Julian Hale, her husband of 5 years, the only person entirely erased from her guest list. It was 6:30 in the evening when Julian pulled up to the hotel's drop-off zone in his black sedan. He stared through the thick glass at the chaotic, joyous party inside, where guests clinked champagne flutes and laughed non-stop. He pulled up every chat log, call record, text and social media thread on his phone, scrolling back a full month, yet not a single message from Clara mentioned the banquet. 5 years prior, Clara had been a low-ranking lab researcher, drowning in dead-end experiments and funding shortages. Julian had abandoned a soaring career in architectural design to stand behind her entirely. He'd sold the family storefront, inherited from his late parents, pouring nearly $280,000 of the proceeds straight into her lab equipment and raw materials. For 3 straight New Year's holidays, she'd locked herself in the lab for non-stop testing, leaving Julian to handle all holiday shopping, travel between both sets of parents, and shoulder every family obligation single-handedly. Clara's mother and father suffered chronic illnesses, requiring routine checkups, medication refills, and repeated hospital stays. Julian took unpaid leave every time to sit by their beds, while Clara never spared an afternoon to visit. Friends had warned him time and again that Clara's career obsession had swallowed any room for their marriage, but Julian had clung to a faint, fragile hope. Once she claimed her hard-earned national award, she would slow down, look home, and see all the sacrifices he'd made for her. This 22-table medal gala was supposed to be their shared triumph. Every lab intern, distant cousin she'd barely spoken to in a decade, and casual business partner had received a personal hand-delivered invitation with reserved seating at the main table. Only her spouse of 5 years had not been told a word, granted no chair, no place at her side. Julian tightened his grip on the camellia bouquet, his knuckles bleaching white under the pressure as he stood on cold marble lobby tile. He'd left work an hour early to pick up her favorite blooms, wrapped in delicate cream paper, planning to hand them to her as she accepted congratulations. Now the flowers weighed like solid stone against his chest, every breath sharp and stinging with quiet heartache. "Sir, I'm so sorry. The hotel events manager stepped forward, his tone heavy with awkward pity. Every seat was locked in a week ago. All 22 tables are at full capacity. Julian forced a hollow, exhausted smile. Did Clara ever mention to her event team that her husband planned to come tonight? The manager's eyes darted away, unwilling to meet his gaze. The entire guest roster was finalized personally by Dr. Wells and her lab team. Your name never appeared on any version of the list. We cannot add extra seating without her explicit approval. Finalized by her own hand. Those 6 words sliced through the 5 years of quiet compromise he'd carried, like a blade without an edge. Julian turned back toward the glass partition, gazing at the woman glowing under a storm of camera flashes. Clara wore a tailored ivory silk evening gown, set with fine diamond jewelry, her dark hair twisted into an elegant updo. She held a champagne flute, greeting deans and industry magnates with polished, practiced poise, her smile bright and untouchable. Not once did her gaze drift toward the lobby glass, not a flicker of thought for the man waiting outside for her. A young lab intern lifted a camera and stepped beside her, asking a question loud enough to drift through the double-paned glass to Julian's ears. Dr. Wells, your research breakthrough would never have happened without family support. Is your husband stuck at work tonight? Julian held his breath, clinging to a last sliver of hope that she would acknowledge him, even with a passing line about him being tied up elsewhere. Instead, Clara brushed a stray strand of hair from her shoulder, her voice light and dismissive, no trace of remorse whatsoever. My partner isn't familiar with academic research events. He'd grow uncomfortable, surrounded by specialists, so we didn't reserve him a seat to avoid awkwardness. Plain, awkward, 2 throwaway sentences that erased every sacrifice Julian had laid at her feet. He'd emptied his family's fortune to save her lab from collapse. He'd sat in his car until 2 a.m., countless nights, waiting for her to finish trials. He'd tended to both sides of their aging relatives alone for years without complaint. Back then, she'd clung to his side and whispered he was her whole lifeline. Now that she stood on a pedestal of national fame, she wrote him off as too ordinary to belong in her shining circle. A single white camellia petal slipped loose from the bouquet and landed on his palm, icy against his skin. He turned away from the party's glittering chaos, set the unmarked flower arrangement on an empty lobby reception counter, and walked silently out to his car. The heavy vehicle doors sealed off all the distant laughter and clinking glass, trapping him in total, suffocating quiet. 5 years he'd functioned as her full-time support system, available at every hour of the day to eliminate every trivial barrier standing between her and her research dreams. He'd turned down cross-country design commissions, skipped industry summits, and declined every social gathering, always telling acquaintances Clara was swamped with lab work and he would attend in her place. Everyone praised her good fortune, but only Julian knew he'd faded into nothing more than a background character in her life story. He'd foolishly imagined this award banquet would be different. He'd pictured her pulling him close at the head table, naming him in her speech, letting the world see the man who'd sacrificed everything for her success. Reality struck him brutally cold. 22 tables full of near strangers had priority over the man she'd sworn to share a life with. This was no oversight. She had intentionally crossed his name off the guest list, intentionally minimized their marriage to reporters, terrified his ordinary background would tarnish her flawless public image as an unburdened genius scientist. Julian's fingers brushed the glove compartment, where he kept stacks of bank transfer receipts, hospital billing slips, and lab equipment invoices. Every tangible proof of the fortune he'd poured into her career. Once, reviewing those papers had filled him with quiet joy, proud to fuel her dreams. Now, they only struck him as a bitter, ridiculous waste. He typed a text into his phone. No screaming accusations, no bitter recriminations, just a calm, frigid statement of everything he'd endured. Clara, I waited downstairs at the hotel for your banquet. There was no seat saved for me, and you never sent word about the event at all. For 5 years, I've given up everything to build your career, and I'm exhausted beyond repair. I'll pack all my belongings tomorrow and move out. I've drafted a divorce agreement outlining asset division and the full research funds I advanced you. I wish you endless success in your lab work. He hovered his thumb over the send button, hesitating one last time. Maybe the lab students had messed up the list without her knowledge. Maybe her offhand comment to the press had been a careless, unthinking slip. He would wait until the night ended, give her a window to reach out, explain, or even just apologize. Julian started the engine and drove aimlessly through Harbor City's nighttime streets, neon billboards blurring across his windshield. Every sidewalk cafe and residential window glowed with warm domestic light, a stark contrast to his own hollow, loveless marriage. 1 a.m., the banquet finally broke. Crowds swarmed out of the hotel behind Clara, journalists crowding around her to snap endless photos. Her phone never buzzed once, no missed calls, no worried texts checking where he'd gone. The last message in their chat thread dated back 3 days prior, a short line from her. The lab is closed for intensive testing this week. Don't wait up for me. No warm check-ins, no soft goodnights. Not a single mention of the 22-table celebration she'd spent months planning. The last faint spark of hope inside him fizzled out completely. All his gentleness, compromise, and endless patience dissolved to ash. He knew, without a shadow of doubt, that he could no longer sustain this one-sided marriage. He drove back to the townhouse they'd shared, pushing open the front door to a silent space saturated with her presence. Coffee mugs she rarely touched littered the coffee table. Stacks of thick research journals covered every surface, and the balcony rail hung lined with her lab coats. The nightstand belonged solely to her skincare and academic texts, while Julian's own possessions barely filled a small cabinet in the spare study. The home had all the markers of a couple's residence, yet it held zero warmth shared between them. Julian pulled blank printer paper from the desk drawer and drafted a formal separation notice, mapping out fair property splits, the return of the $280,000 lab investment he'd fronted, and a reasonable timeline for repayment. The townhouse had been 70% funded by his pre-marriage down payment, yet he offered to sign the deed fully over to her. He only asked for the exact money he'd poured into her failing research years prior. There was no greed, no vengeful demands, just a quiet desire to reclaim what had been taken from him. He printed a digital copy to store on his cloud drive, then packed 2 small rolling suitcases with all his clothing, design drafts, and personal books. Every large piece of furniture, every kitchen appliance, he left untouched for her. As he folded his last sweater, he felt no tears, only a heavy, weightless sense of release after half a decade of unbroken sacrifice. At 3:30 a.m., Julian dragged his luggage out the front door, glancing back once at the empty living room without a flicker of longing. He drove to a small condo he'd owned alone before their wedding, a space left vacant for years that would now serve as his temporary refuge. Once he wiped dust off the furniture and laid fresh sheets on the bed, he sent the long-drafted text to Clara, powered off his cell phone, and fell into a dreamless sleep, no longer waiting for any reply from her. Clara woke at 9 the next morning in a hotel suite connected to the banquet venue. The after-party with senior academics had stretched until 4 a.m., so she'd never returned home. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her screen flooded with hundreds of congratulatory texts and missed calls from colleagues, reporters, and lab staff. She skimmed through the notifications quickly, firing off generic replies to every well-wisher, utterly oblivious to the divorce message buried far down her inbox beneath all the celebration buzz. Mia Carter, her lead lab assistant, pulled up to the hotel lobby 10 minutes later with a printed daily schedule. 3 live media interviews this morning, a private luncheon with academy directors at noon, full lab staff awards assembly in the afternoon, and biotech investor dinners this evening, she rattled off, handing Clara a paper coffee cup. The banquet last night was a total triumph. When reporters asked about your family, you smartly steered the conversation away from personal matters to keep your professional brand uncomplicated. That was such a clever call. Clara smoothed the fabric of her linen blouse, a casual, unconcerned smirk tugging at her lips. Events focused on academia don't mix well with non-scientific family members. Julian's background in architecture would create awkward small talk all night. I didn't want the atmosphere disrupted. That thought sat in stark contrast to the words she'd spoken 5 years earlier, when her lab faced collapse and he'd handed over his life savings. You're the only anchor I have in this chaotic world. Mia nodded in eager agreement. An architect's career exists in a totally separate sphere from advanced biotech. It would have looked unprofessional to have him sitting among all the award-winning scientists last night. Clara didn't spare a single moment of guilt over deliberately erasing him from her guest roster. In her rigid hierarchy of priorities, research always came first, and Julian existed merely as a caretaker to handle domestic trivialities that would distract her from groundbreaking discoveries. She hopped into Mia's car and headed to the first interview studio. Every camera lens locked onto her as she discussed her new lab's development roadmap, and again, when journalists asked about personal support systems, she glossed over the topic entirely, crafting a public persona of a solitary, unburdened genius, untethered to domestic ties. By the time her third interview wrapped, Clara finally paused to scroll through her unread messages. The text from Julian caught her eye, and she skimmed the lines in a split second, a faint, fleeting frown crossing her face before vanishing entirely. She dismissed his declaration of separation and divorce as a childish tantrum over being excluded from the party. For 5 years, every minor disagreement had ended with Julian backing down, cooking her comfort food, and apologizing for upsetting her. She assumed this time would be no different. She tapped the message to mute notifications from his chat thread, never once picking up the phone to call, never typing a single line of explanation or remorse. The upcoming week's investor negotiations demanded all her mental bandwidth. She couldn't waste time soothing his petty mood swings. At the director's luncheon, senior biologists debated her lab's 5-year expansion plans, and Clara threw herself into the conversation, completely wiping Julian's text and his disappearance from her mind. Halfway through the meal, Mia leaned over to murmur a quiet question. "Dr. Wells, should I shoot Julian a quick text to calm him down about last night's banquet?" Clara sipped her red wine with a dismissive wave. "No need. He'll mope for 2 days max before he shows up at the lab door with soup to apologize. Once I wrap up this week's investor meetings, I'll swing home with his favorite white peach cake and the fight will blow over. He'd never actually go through with filing divorce paperwork. It's just empty dramatic talk." Her tone dripped with unshakable certainty, convinced Julian would always wait patiently for her to spare him a scrap of attention, no matter how many times she ignored his feelings. It never crossed her mind that last night's heartbreak had shattered the last thread of his patience, that this was far more than a fleeting fit of irritation. That afternoon, standing on the lab auditorium stage with her medal clutched in one hand, Clara delivered a lengthy acceptance speech thanking mentors, university administration, lab technicians, funding bodies, and policy advocates. Not one single phrase acknowledged the husband who'd sacrificed his entire career to keep her research alive. Hundreds of staff and interns roared with applause, unaware that the man who'd funded their lab's survival had already packed his bags and walked out of their shared life. After the awards ceremony, a line of CEOs blocked her path to pitch multi-million-dollar collaboration deals. Clara spent hours locked in boardroom negotiations, silencing her phone to zero notifications, cutting off every possible line of communication with Julian entirely. Meanwhile, at the downtown condo Julian had once called home, he cut off all active outreach to Clara. For years, he'd sent her good morning texts, reminders to eat, and late-night check-ins whenever she pulled all-nighters in the lab. Now, his phone sat on silent mode, no calls placed, no messages sent. He'd kept her contact information unblocked, refusing to sink to petty retaliation. Yet, he refused to take the first step toward reconciliation, waiting for her to recognize the depth of her cruelty on her own. 3 full days passed without a single word from Clara. She bounced between conference halls, lab offices, and corporate dinner venues, never once returning to their townhouse, fully convinced Julian had only rented a hotel room to brood temporarily and would return to tidy the house within 48 hours. The weekly housekeeper arrived for her scheduled cleaning shift, pushed open the front door, and froze at the sight of empty closet space and bare bookshelves where Julian's architectural volumes had once sat. She dialed Clara's cell phone mid-video conference, the line crackling with static. "Ms. Wells, all of Mr. Hale's belongings are gone from the townhouse. Has he left for a long business trip? Should I air out the empty rooms regularly?" Clara's voice sharpened with irritation at the unwanted interruption. "He's throwing a small tantrum and we'll be back in a couple days. Just clean as normal, there's no need to fuss over him." She hung up instantly, diving back into her international research video call without a second thought. The housekeeper sighed heavily as she dusted the empty study, remembering countless nights she'd watched Julian wait in the car until 3 a.m. outside the lab building, and how he'd handled every doctor's visit for Clara's aging parents without a single complaint. It pained her to witness Clara's total blindness to all he'd given her. 3 days later, Clara cleared her packed calendar and drove back to the townhouse for the first time since the banquet. The second she pushed open the front door, a cold, hollow silence washed over her. The warm mugs of herbal tea Julian always left on the counter were gone, the refrigerator bare, and every cooking pot had been scrubbed clean and stacked away. The walk-in closets left half, once filled with his suits and casual wear, stood completely vacant, only rows of her elaborate gowns and lab coats hanging on the racks. His herbal sleep tea and architectural notebooks had vanished from the nightstand as well. A flicker of unease pricked at her chest, yet she quickly brushed it aside, still convinced he'd only rented a nearby hotel for a few days to wallow. She pulled out her phone and typed a lazy, dismissive text to send to his muted thread. "Stop being dramatic and pick yourself up. I've been swamped with investor meetings all week, but I'll head home early tonight and grab that peach cake you love to smooth this over. Don't keep threatening divorce over trivial spats." She tossed her phone onto the leather sofa and wandered into the study to sort lab documents, fully expecting a reply within minutes that would signal his surrender. Hours slipped by, and the message remained unread, no ping of a response ever coming through. Clara grew restless, tapping his contact and hitting dial 5 separate times in a row. Each call bounced straight to a do not disturb automated voice prompt. The 5th, disconnected call split the thin layer of overconfidence she'd wrapped around herself. Panic flooded her veins, cold and numbing. For every argument they'd ever endured, Julian had never blocked her calls, never ignored her texts for more than an hour. Even if she'd stayed out until 4 a.m., He always kept his line open in case the lab suffered an emergency that required her to reach him. Now she couldn't even connect with him over the phone, and the silent blank chat window was a heavy slap to her self-assurance. Dread coiled tight in her stomach as she grabbed her car keys and rushed out the door. Her first stop was his architecture firm. The receptionist looked up at her hurried, ashen face with quiet sympathy. Mr. Hale submitted an indefinite personal leave request 3 days ago. He's handed off every active project and disconnected all work contact channels. We have no way to reach him at all. Clara's knees nearly buckled beneath her weight. Handing over all client work meant this was no fleeting fit of anger. He'd planned a full, permanent withdrawal from every part of their intertwined lives. For years, he'd rejected high-value, out-of-state design projects to stay local and accommodate her erratic lab schedule, and now he'd cut his career loose without hesitation. She stumbled out of the office and drove straight to Ethan Ward's townhouse, Julian's oldest college friend, who'd watched every sacrifice Julian had made over the past 5 years, and repeatedly warned him against overextending himself for a partner who took his devotion for granted. Ethan opened the front door to find Clara trembling, tears already welling in her eyes. "Where is Julian? He moved all his things out, won't answer my calls or texts." Ethan's expression hardened with unmasked disappointment, no trace of pity in his tone. "You want to know where he was the night of your 22-table banquet? He stood in that hotel lobby for 2 hours, clutching camellias he'd bought you, watching you laugh with every stranger while his name didn't even exist on your guest roster." Clara's lips parted, ready to offer a shallow defense about academic awkwardness, but Ethan cut her off sharply, pulling up a late-night chat log Julian had sent him 3 nights prior. "He texted me at 3 a.m. that night. 5 years of draining every dollar he owns to fund your research, and he can't even earn a single seat at your celebration. He's done fighting for this marriage." He ticked off every unspoken sacrifice Julian had never bothered to voice to her, each fact landing like a weight on her shoulders. He sold his family's lifelong retail store to cover your lab's $280,000 shortfall without asking for a single IOU. Every hospital stay for your parents was covered by his unpaid leave. You never once stepped foot in a ward to visit them. Every Lunar New Year for 3 years, he traveled between both families alone to handle gifts and dinners, while you locked yourself in labs. Rain or shine, he waited outside until 2 a.m. to drive you home after testing sessions. Everyone at that banquet got a spot: your summer intern, a distant cousin you haven't spoken to in a decade, random investors. Only the man who built your career from ruin got erased entirely, Ethan said flatly. You labeled him unrefined for the crowd, but none of your research would exist without the sacrifices he made. Clara's frame shook violently, years of blind self-absorption crashing down on her all at once. She'd taken every late-night ride, every hospital vigil, every 6-figure cash injection as a given, never pausing to acknowledge how much labor and loss it had cost him. Her voice cracked with sobs. "I was buried under non-stop lab negotiations. I thought he'd just be upset for a few days and forgive me once I apologized. I never realized how much pain that caused him." "You never took 5 minutes to ask how he felt," Ethan sighed. "Every time he tried to mention how lonely he was, you brushed him off by saying, 'Lab work came first.' This isn't a temporary tantrum. He drafted full legal separation paperwork after that night, every line thought through for weeks, not a spur-of-the-moment choice." Clara's panic spiraled into full-blown despair. She begged Ethan to give her Julian's condo address, and he relented, warning her that the damage ran far deeper than a single banquet oversight. She raced to the suburban complex as twilight swallowed the sky, autumn wind biting at her cheeks as she sprinted up the stairs and hammered on the front door. The door creaked open, and Julian stood in simple cotton loungewear, his face calm, stripped of any lingering fondness or resentment. Only a quiet, distant neutrality hung between them. The second Clara saw his empty, unyielding gaze, all her defenses crumbled, hot tears spilling down her cheeks as she reached out to grab his wrist. He stepped sideways gently, evading her touch without cruelty, yet making his boundary crystal clear. "I'm so sorry, Julian. Please forgive me," she choked, shoulders heaving with uncontrolled grief. "I was thoughtless and vain that night. I shouldn't have cut your name from the list or said those things to reporters. I thought you'd just sulk a little. I never knew how broken you felt. Don't file for divorce. I'll fix everything." Julian stepped aside to let her cross the threshold into the sparse condo, every surface stripped of traces of her presence. "Let's sit and go over the separation terms calmly. There's no point rehashing emotional outbursts right now." Clara sank onto the plain fabric sofa, wiping constant streams of tears from her cheeks as she stared up at him, desperate for a shred of leniency. "I'll split every chore with you from now on. I'll attend every dinner, every research event with you at my side. I'll take turns visiting our parents at the hospital, carve out 2 full days every week just for us. I'll pay back all the lab funding within a single year instead of 2. Anything you want, just don't walk away from us." Julian laid the printed divorce contract flat on the coffee table, his finger tracing each balanced, equitable clause. The townhouse deed would transfer fully to her. He only requested the exact $280,000 he'd advanced for lab supplies, repayable over 2 years with 0 interest. There were no bitter demands, no attempts to seize assets as punishment, only a quiet request to reclaim what he'd willingly surrendered for her dream. "This isn't about one banquet, Clara," he said softly, without a hint of anger. "It's 5 years of me being permanently relegated to the background of your life. I've never begrudged your dedication to science, but I cannot keep living as a disposable caretaker who's barred from every milestone you celebrate. A partnership requires mutual care and mutual pride in one another's achievements, and for half a decade, only I've been putting in the effort to nurture us. I've waited years to be someone you're proud to stand beside in front of your peers, and every chance you got, you pushed me aside. I don't hate you, but I'm completely drained of the endless compromise I've carried alone." Clara stared at the neat, fair wording of the contract, tears blurring the ink on every page. "I didn't mean to dismiss you. I just got wrapped up in the pressure of the lab launch." Julian shook his head gently. Excuses rang hollow after 5 years of identical justifications. "This pattern stretches back long before the medal gala. Every small award dinner, every industry mixer, you intentionally left me out. We rarely shared a quiet meal, rarely had a real conversation without you rushing off to testing. I don't blame you for chasing your goals, but I can't spend the rest of my life invisible to the person I married." Clara reached for his hand again, and once more he stepped back, creating space between them. "Take the contract home to review. You can reach my lawyer with any adjustments you'd like to propose. I won't return to the townhouse or pick up your calls for the time being. When you've made your decision, we can set an appointment at the county clerk's office." Clara's body went limp, the full weight of irreversible loss crashing over her. For the following 7 days, she paused every lab project, cancelled all media appearances and investor meetings, and threw every waking hour into desperate attempts to make amends. Yet every gesture arrived too late to mend the years of accumulated neglect. Morning 1, she returned to their old townhouse and attempted to replicate the congee breakfast Julian had cooked for her every dawn for 5 years. She burned the grain and ruined the steamed buns, filling the kitchen with burnt smoke. She packed the failed meal in an insulated carrier and drove to his condo, knocking repeatedly with no answer, leaving the container on the doorstep to sit cold, untouched until evening. When Julian returned home, he glanced at the carrier and left it unopened by the trash bin, never reaching out to acknowledge her gesture. Morning 2. She spent an entire shift at the hospital, caring for her own parents, a task Julian had single-handedly managed for years. Her mother watched her red-rimmed eyes and sighed. Julian was here every single week for years to tend to us. Don't let a good man slip away over pride and work. After the care shift ended, she brought homemade herbal soup to his condo once more, only to find the door unanswered again, the broth growing cold on the concrete landing. Day 3. She tracked down the retail storefront Julian had sold to fund her research, offering the current owner a massive markup to repurchase the property. The owner refused to sell, the business having changed hands multiple times since the sale. She rushed to his apartment complex to wait 4 hours for his return, begging to buy the store back as restitution. Julian declined evenly, explaining the choice had been voluntary 5 years prior, and no additional compensation was necessary beyond the scheduled repayment outlined in the divorce papers. Day 4. She visited his architecture firm to apologize to his supervisors and co-workers, begging them to allow him to resume his projects. The management team told her he'd permanently stepped away from all client work with no plans to return, and every colleague looked at her with quiet pity, recalling how he'd sacrificed his career repeatedly for her schedule. Day 5. She packed every medal, trophy, and framed research certificate she'd earned over the years into a large cardboard box, attaching a handwritten, multi-page letter filled with remorse and pleas for a second chance. She left the box at his building's front desk, yet Julian had the concierge return every item unread the same evening, the letter untouched. Those awards had only existed because of his sacrifice, and they held no weight to fix what had broken between them. Day 6. She recruited her parents, his relatives, and Ethan to join her outside his condo to plead with him for reconciliation. Every family member spoke of their 5 years of shared history, urging him to pause the divorce process and reconcile temporarily. Julian listened politely, yet his resolve never wavered. "I hold no resentment toward her, but I can't continue a relationship where only one person sacrifices endlessly." The group fell silent, recognizing the years of quiet exhaustion etched into his features, and stopped pressuring him after his calm, unyielding explanation. Day 7. She arrived at his condo without gifts or grand gestures, sitting across from him on the simple sofa to lay bare every regret weighing on her heart. "This past week, I've done every chore you handled alone for 5 years, and just 7 days left me completely worn thin. I can't imagine how you endured that burden without a single helping hand from me all those years. That banquet was the worst mistake of my life, driven by vanity and a misplaced obsession with my professional image. If we stay together, I'll split every household duty, attend every event at your side, and prioritize us over lab deadlines from now on." Julian listened to her lengthy promises without a flicker of emotion, then shook his head slowly. "The changes you're willing to make only arrived after you'd already lost me. For 5 years, I begged for small slivers of your time and attention, and you never had space to spare. The cold distance between us built one ignored evening, one missed conversation, one excluded celebration at a time. The banquet was just the final breaking point, not the root of our rift." He slid the notarized duplicate divorce papers across the coffee table toward her. "We can complete the filing next week if you're ready. There's no malice between us, just 2 people who grew to live entirely separate lives." Clara clutched the documents tightly, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely hold the pages, tears soaking through the printed text as she shook her head over and over, refusing to accept the inevitable separation. 2 weeks of fruitless begging and desperate amends passed. On a crisp Monday morning, they met at the county marriage bureau. Julian arrived calm and composed, free of lingering attachment to the past 5 years. Clara dragged herself through the front doors with dark purple circles under her eyes, the crumpled divorce contract crinkled in her white-knuckled grip. The clerk verified their identification and asked if both parties entered the separation willingly. Clara glanced repeatedly at Julian, searching for any hint of hesitation on his face, yet his expression remained steady and unchanging. It took her more than 10 minutes to steady her shaking hand enough to sign her legal name across the dotted line. Once the 2 official divorce certificates were printed and handed over, they stepped back out onto the sidewalk into autumn's cold wind. Clara's voice cracked raw as she spoke. "Can I still reach out occasionally to pay you the monthly research repayments and check in?" Julian offered a quiet, distant smile. "You may send the scheduled bank transfers on the agreed dates, but further contact isn't necessary. I wish you every success with your lab work." With that final, neutral well-wish, he turned and walked to his sedan, driving away without a single backward glance. Clara sank onto the concrete curb, sobbing openly as passers-by glanced at her with quiet sympathy. She'd reached the pinnacle of her scientific career, yet permanently lost the only person who'd built that success alongside her. The 22-table victory gala that had been her proudest moment had simultaneously destroyed the love that sustained her through every hardship. In the years following their split, their lives diverged completely onto separate paths. Julian returned to architecture design, taking on landmark skyscraper commissions across southern coastal cities, building a fulfilling, balanced career, unburdened by endless compromise for another person's dreams. He purchased a quiet riverfront apartment filled with his sketches and design portfolios, filling his free time with hiking and dinners with Ethan and other old friends. No longer trapped waiting late nights outside labs or managing every family obligation single-handedly, he found a quiet peace he'd never known during their marriage. He rarely heard news of Clara, and whenever a passing social media headline covered her lab breakthroughs, he glanced past it without lingering, the 5 years of sacrifice now a closed chapter he'd fully processed and let go of. Clara, meanwhile, oversaw explosive growth at her national research lab, securing hundreds of millions in federal funding and publishing groundbreaking scientific papers. Yet her life was permanently stained with quiet loneliness. Every award banquet, academic conference, and industry gala she hosted now reserved an empty chair at the left side of the main table, setting out 2 full-place settings each time, one for herself, one for the man she'd pushed away forever. Journalists regularly asked about the vacant seat during post-event interviews, and she would speak softly about the person who'd given her everything, only to be discarded by her own vanity, her voice thick with unending regret. She transferred the scheduled repayment installments to Julian's bank account every 12 months, each wire transfer annotated with the line, "A debt I can never fully repay," yet he never replied to a single attached paragraph of apology. During holidays, she handled every doctor's appointment and family gathering alone, finally understanding the crushing weight Julian had carried for half a decade. Every empty room in their old townhouse reminded her of his quiet labor, and she kept the home unchanged, too haunted to remove any trace of the life they'd once shared. She sent Ethan repeated requests to arrange a casual meeting with Julian to apologize properly, yet every plea was gently turned down on his behalf. 2 full years after their divorce, the annual National Biotech Summit returned to Harbor City International Hotel, the same venue that had hosted the infamous 22-table medal banquet. The event planners set 25 tables this time, an even larger crowd of scientists and investors than 2 years prior. Mia laid the printed seating chart on the lounge counter, glancing hesitantly at her supervisor. "Dr. Wells, we can fill the empty seat beside you with one of the lab directors if you'd like." Clara's fingers brushed the blank space printed on the document, then shook her head faintly. "Leave it empty. There's no one to fill it anymore." Mia fell silent, having watched her supervisor transform dramatically over those 2 years. Once obsessed with maintaining a flawless, unburdened public image, Clara now left a spare chair and paired set of tableware at every formal function, as if waiting for a ghost to slide into the seat beside her. "Should I attempt to contact Mr. Hale and extend an invitation for tonight's summit?" "There's no use," Clara whispered, her gaze drifting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the hotel lobby. "He won't come." Over the past 24 months, Clara had sent hundreds of remorseful texts, lengthy reflective emails, and annual repayment notes filled with paragraphs of regret. Julian had never typed a single reply, only processing the scheduled wire transfers without acknowledgement. Ethan had met with her once late the previous winter over coffee, and his words had been unflinchingly honest. "Julian doesn't hate you, but he's built a peaceful life down the southern coast and refuses to revisit all the pain from that chapter of his past. He doesn't wish to rehash old wounds or reopen a cycle of guilt and apologies." Clara had sat in that cafe beneath grey winter rain for hours, clutching a lukewarm latte, realizing the damage from that night 2 years prior had created an impassable wall between them, built from years of overlooked loneliness rather than one single argument. That evening, the ballroom glittered under identical crystal chandeliers, the hum of champagne flutes and academic chatter filling the air once more. Colleagues lined up to offer congratulations to Clara, yet her gaze drifted constantly to the unoccupied chair at her elbow. When guests asked about the empty seat, she no longer brushed off the question with dismissive talk of awkward family members. Instead, she spoke in a quiet, mournful tone. "There was someone who once sat there with me, and I lost him all because of my own foolish pride." A hush would fall over the surrounding group, everyone familiar with the well-known story of the 22-table banquet that shattered her marriage. Midway through the night's keynote address, the host invited Clara to the stage to deliver a speech on her lab's 2 years of progress. She gripped the microphone tightly, her eyes sweeping the packed ballroom before landing on that vacant seat beside the main podium. 2 years ago, in this exact room, I hosted a 22-table celebration for my national medal win. Every intern, distant relative, and business partner received an invitation, every chair filled, except the man who sold his family's livelihood to save my lab from bankruptcy, who sat waiting alone in the lobby glass wall while I celebrated without a single thought for him. The entire banquet hall fell silent, every guest's attention fixed on her solemn figure atop the stage. Back then, I was blinded by professional glory, convinced a spouse with a non-academic background would embarrass me in front of my peers. I ignored 5 years of selfless care and wrote him off as too ordinary to share my spotlight. I thought a few rushed apologies after my busy schedule would mend everything, only to discover love and patience cannot survive endless neglect. Every trophy, every lab grant means nothing if there's no one beside you to celebrate it with. 2 years of solitary quiet has been my penance for that night's cruelty. She bowed her head in a quiet gesture of remorse, and the audience responded with soft, somber applause, devoid of the wild cheers from 2 years prior. After her speech concluded, she remained seated beside the empty chair long after every guest had filed out of the ballroom. Mia lingered nearby, ready to drive her home, yet Clara waved her off. "I want to stay a little longer. I need to stand where he stood that night, to feel the loneliness he endured alone. She wandered down to the ground floor lobby, pausing beside the same reception counter where she'd discarded the white camellia bouquet 2 years prior. The polished marble reflected her gaunt, weary face, and autumn wind slipped through the glass entrance, carrying the same cold chill Julian had felt waiting for her that evening. Her mind replayed every quiet sacrifice she'd overlooked: late-night drives home from the lab, years of hospital vigils, the storefront he'd sacrificed without hesitation, all the lonely holiday dinners he'd endured by himself while she buried herself in research. Every small kindness she'd taken for granted pricked her heart like a sharp needle. Thousands of miles south along the coastal waterfront, Julian stood on the glass observation deck of his new landmark skyscraper project. The river stretched out beneath him, lined with glowing waterfront lanterns that strung together into a winding golden ribbon. The team had finished the building's structural frame that day, and they'd booked 2 simple tables of local seafood to celebrate their milestone, laughter floating through the open balcony air. Ethan stepped beside him, following his gaze out over the illuminated waterway. Still staring at the river lights? Julian's lips tugged into a faint, peaceful smile, unburdened of the weight he'd carried for half a decade. The quiet down here beats endless banquet noise and suffocating formal events by a mile. Over the past 2 years, he'd turned down every out-of-state design offer he'd once sacrificed to avoid traveling across coastal cities to build iconic waterfront towers. His apartment was filled with sketchbooks and tropical houseplants, free of lab journals and endless cold mugs of herbal tea. He hiked on weekends, dined with old friends without rushing home to rush into domestic labor, and lived a slow, unpressured life free of one-sided sacrifice. He'd seen occasional social media clips of Clara's summit speeches, but only glanced past them without lingering, the past firmly sealed away. A colleague forwarded a recording of Clara's summit keynote to Ethan a few days prior, and he'd shared it with Julian that afternoon. Multiple industry peers had sent over the video clip as well. She talked at length about the 22-table banquet and keeps an empty chair at every event now. Do you feel any urge to reach out to her after hearing that speech? Julian brushed his palm along the cool metal railing, his expression calm and unshaken. I don't harbor anger toward her, but the years of constant dismissal can't be erased by a few late apologies. She's learned to value companionship only after losing it, yet all those lonely nights I endured can't be rewritten. Separation was the kindest choice for both of us to find our own peace. No need to dig up old wounds again. Ethan nodded, understanding fully the depth of exhaustion Julian had carried during their marriage. He handed over a thick brown paper envelope he'd brought along to the waterfront dinner. She asked me to pass this along, extra cash to fully repay the storefront she made you sell, plus a handwritten journal filled with 2 years of daily regret entries. Julian gently pushed the envelope back toward his friend. The divorce settlement outlined the repayment plan, and no extra compensation is required. I don't need to reread pages of sorrow over what's already finished. Tell her I wish her continued success in research, but we're better off keeping our distance from one another. Ethan tucked the envelope away without pushing the subject further, knowing Julian's gentle resolve would never waver once set. After the casual seafood dinner wrapped up, the team dispersed, and Julian walked alone along the river's pedestrian path, the lantern light shimmering across the water's surface. His phone screen sat blank, free of hundreds of unread remorseful texts that had once flooded his inbox. When headlines about Clara's lab breakthroughs crossed his feed occasionally, he scrolled past without pause. Their 5 years together were a closed chapter he'd fully processed and released. Love had faded, not from one single fight, but thousands of tiny ignored moments stacked on top of one another, and no amount of post-separation guilt could undo that slow erosion. On New Year's Eve, snow drifted softly over Harbour City as Clara's lab team hosted a small, 25-person private dinner. The seat to her left remained empty, 2 matching bowls of braised congee set on the table before her. Halfway through the meal, her phone buzzed with a photo Ethan had sent. Julian, surrounded by laughing design teammates at a riverside hot pot restaurant, relaxed and carefree beneath strings of holiday lanterns. A short line of text sat beneath the image. "He's content here. Don't keep reaching out to disturb his peace." Clara's fingers tightened around the cold glass phone, her eyes stinging. She'd dreamed of handing this journal to Julian to explain her remorse, yet she now understood it would only be an unwanted burden for him. The midnight countdown bells rang loud outside, and she rested her forehead on the cold tabletop, silent sobs shaking her shoulders as the dual bowls of porridge cooled slowly in front of her. Early spring the following year brought a joint cross-industry convention hosted inside the same downtown exhibition complex. Clara attended as head of life sciences panels, while Julian flew into town to present his waterfront landmark designs at the architecture wing. During the midday break, the building's central corridor swarmed with attendees, and their paths crossed by pure coincidence. Julian carried a stack of design blueprints, flanked by 2 junior designers chatting about structural calculations, his features relaxed and unburdened, nothing left of the worn, exhausted man she'd known during their marriage. Their eyes locked for a split second. Clara froze mid-step, every unspoken apology she'd rehearsed for months rushing to her throat. She leaned forward slightly, ready to speak, yet Julian only paused for a heartbeat, offered a quiet, neutral nod of recognition, and continued walking past her without slowing his pace, never glancing back once. No harsh words, no lingering stares, nothing more than the brief acknowledgement 2 passing strangers might exchange. Clara stood rooted to the tile floor, her blood running cold in her veins as she watched his figure disappear around the corridor bend. All her months of regret and desperate longing amounted to nothing more than a fleeting, distant nod. Ethan rounded the corner moments later and found her standing motionless, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I warned you. He's fully moved on," she whispered brokenly. "I just needed to say I'm sorry." Ethan sighed softly. "You said everything from that summit stage to a crowd of hundreds 2 years ago. He doesn't require a private apology to find closure, and rehashing the pain won't help either of you heal." That banquet night pushed him away permanently, and no amount of regret can rewrite the past. The spring conference ended, and each returned to their separate cities, no further chance encounters crossing their paths in the months that followed. Julian continued his architectural work, living a quiet, self-focused life, free of unbalanced compromise. He never looked back at the marriage that had drained him for half a decade, recalling it only as a valuable lesson on the necessity of mutual respect in a partnership. Clara remained at the helm of her world-famous research lab, racking up constant breakthroughs and international awards, yet carried a permanent hollow space in her daily routine, reserving an empty seat at every formal gathering as a quiet, lifelong reminder of the choice that cost her the only person who'd ever loved her without condition. Every autumn, on the anniversary of that 22-table medal gala, she visited the hotel lobby alone, standing where Julian had waited with camellias 2 years prior, sitting in quiet, solitary reflection for an hour to relive the loneliness she'd forced upon him. She'd fully repaid the $280,000 lab investment per the divorce agreement, yet knew the emotional debt she owed him could never be settled with currency. Every new year, every industry summit, every quiet evening at home alone drove home the same bitter truth. She'd climbed to the absolute peak of her professional ambitions, yet traded the only unconditional love she'd ever received for a fleeting moment of vanity and stage glory. Glittering awards and global acclaim meant nothing without a person to share them with. She'd spent every day since that fateful banquet drowning in quiet, endless remorse, forced to live with the permanent empty chair at every table as a lifelong penance for the thoughtless, cruel choice she'd made all those years ago. Far down the southern coastline, Julian watched the river lanterns glow each evening beside his completed waterfront skyscrapers, peaceful and unburdened, having walked away from a one-sided love that had slowly drained every ounce of his joy, finally free to build a life centered entirely on his own hopes and dreams. Would the man who sacrificed 5 years of his entire life to support her ever soften and open his heart to reconciliation again? Would the scientist, trapped